theorist working on VQAs, variational quantum eigensolvers, and quantum simulation. He has some of the most influential papers in this field, and we're very excited to hear his talk offering perspectives on quantum computing and learning in chemistry.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Sophia, and thanks to the organizers for this invitation. I was excited to kind of get this invitation because I'd had a little bit of an idea brewing for something that I wanted to say at this intersection. And I think maybe, you know, you don't always get so lucky as to start doing a project that changes your perspective on a lot of parts of science, but I feel like I was recently so lucky, and I hope to be able to communicate tidbits of that today and some of the ways that I think the ideas go beyond even the project itself. And so some parts of what I'll say today will be just rigorous results from that paper, but some part will be open questions and speculation that I hope you'll either enjoy or feel so upset by that you'll at least engage them in an energetic debate. So with that, I'll kind of kick things off. So as I understand it, this audience is kind of a background of machine learning people and quantum people, all kind of were interested in what the combinations therein could be: quantum chemistry, quantum machine learning, device physics, etc. So I like to kind of start off this general timeline of quantum computing where I spend a lot of my time thinking. So if you kind of make this graph over time of the excitement about what quantum computing can do, you will often find that, for example, in 1994, there was this peak for Shor's factoring algorithm, and which threatened to break RSA and all of encryption and made a lot of three-letter agencies very frightened. And then, you know, people realized quantum computers and quantum devices were pretty hard to control, pretty hard to build. So excitement waned a little bit. More recently, there's been some nice jumps in the advances of quantum hardware and our technologies around quantum error correction, which made people excited enough that perhaps we were close enough that our qubits could start to beat thresholds, which was enough de-risking for a lot of larger players to get involved, for a lot of funding agencies to get involved. And this kind of culminated most recently in our group's kind of quantum supremacy or advantage result, which showed that there are particular tasks, even if they're contrived, that it seems quantum computers are much, much better suited to do than classical ones in kind of an experimental sense. And yet we're still some ways away, it seems, from using these devices for practical applications. And many of those practical applications being the simulation of chemistry or the simulation of other quantum systems, which a lot of what I work on focuses on working in this particular area before we can eventually move towards error-corrected quantum computation. And sort of, it's interesting, you know, this conference is on machine learning and quantum simulation and quantum chemistry. And if you look at the early application areas that people have identified, at least one of them is optimization, which you could argue is can be used in service of machine learning, should you so choose. Machine learning itself, which I'll talk a little bit about the quantum versions of that later, and the quantum simulation of systems. And so it's no coincidence, I think, that precisely controllable quantum systems are best suited to simulate quantum systems. But I think some of the things I want to argue today is it goes beyond just rote computation, but offers a new perspective on what we can do for these types of systems as well. So what is kind of the most basic version of quantum simulation or quantum computation? Maybe basic is the wrong word, or most natural. So if I have some physical system I'm interested in, say I have some little blue excitation up there and my system has a Hamiltonian, and I'm just going to start in some state and I'm going to walk forward in time. So I'm going to use my computer to simulate the time-dependent Schrödinger equation. And this is actually a rapidly developing field. Even for chemistry, I think some chemists would be interested to know that there are numerically exact evolutions available that are now sublinear in the number of basis functions. So in like the full CI space, if you're a chemist, exact diagonalization space, if you're a physicist, just pretty exciting. And exact classical competition, as far as we can tell, hits a hard exponential wall. Even methods that are sophisticated with entanglement truncation have a hard time with fully correlated dynamics for interacting systems. But Since much of the study of quantum computing until this point has been theoretical, we've had a lot of time to think about, if you had a device that could do this, what would it mean? And it's interesting to note that even quantum computers have limits. So there is such a thing as a sort of speed limit for quantum computers, and one that is quantified in computation as the no fast forwarding theorem. And if I just kind of very much caricature this powerful result, it basically says that the simulation time required for some physical process on my computer is some factor times the physical time it would require. And so if I used no other human insight and I just trudged forward along and waited for events to happen, I might be discouraged by numbers like chemical reaction rates that happen at something like 10 to the minus 10 per second. And so what does that mean for me? Well, it means that I have to be a little bit smarter than just moving forward, because I know I have this proof that no matter how good I get at algorithms, simply stepping forward in time cannot reveal the answers to all the questions that I have. And we already do this a little bit when we make this statement. So I'm sure you've seen it referenced in other quantum computing talks about the underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics and the whole of chemistry being completely known, and that we only need to solve these equations, basically. And we very quickly make the step to the time-independent Schrodinger equation, which of course is a simple manipulation you do in undergraduate quantum mechanics. But the reason that it's relevant is that we've brought in real-world knowledge that not only are eigenstates important, but if we have reasonable energy scales, it can present a simplification that I only need to consider certain aspects of this equation, like low-lying energy states, instead of the entire spectrum in its full generality. And what does it mean usually to directly simulate chemistry? Usually I write down some set of atoms or a protein or system that I'm interested in, and I try to glean some amount of understanding from solutions like that equation that I just showed. For example, how a molecule absorbs light, how it complexes with different species, or to watch a process where kind of you go and complex with a surface. But in all of these cases, I've sort of already come to you with some process that I know is interesting, and I've used that direct simulation to get further understanding at a microscopic level that I couldn't get before. And the hope is that understanding leads to better control, so better design of new photovoltaics, better understanding of how to design drugs to prevent disease onset, or perhaps better catalysts, cheaper ones that could go into my catalytic converter. And so you might start to believe that we have these reduced computations. We've become very good at these identification of reduced physical observables, like we've given energy a privileged place, free energy. We know that transition states are often important, these kind of things that we've identified through observation and reduction, the scientific process. And so you might ask, can all physically interesting questions be answered by some reduced model? And those questions might be relatively simple ones, like, does a system thermalize? Our native treatment of the ergodic hypothesis or belief in the second law might have us believe that that's always a resounding yes. Does a system have an electronic gap, or will molecule X be ever formed from constituents Y? And recently, a fun string of results in quantum computer science, kind of designed to probe the limits of what any quantum computer, even the universe, can do, have proven that these problems are what is called undecidable. So this is sort of the hardest type of problem that you can have, or hardest reasonable type of problem you can have, which states that there can exist no algorithm which solves these problems in general, even for infinite time. So for this audience, there's actually sort of a physical definition that I'll borrow from Chris Moore, which is physical undecidability means essentially that as a system evolves in time, there are sudden qualitative changes that cannot be predicted in any way except evolving forward in time and seeing if it happens. And no answer in finite time can tell you along the way if that event will never happen. And so that kind of sounds reminiscent of if I started from, say, a pool of small molecules, and then suddenly I had amino acids, proteins, DNA, cells. These are all very qualitative changes that feel very hard to predict. So you might, from at least a glance, say, well, chemistry actually does feel a little undecidable in an open system sense. So why am I saying something which sounds so depressing? I think it actually offers an interesting perspective that will link to machine learning in a minute, which is undecidability can actually be broken by something called advice. So advice is formally sort of this kind of polynomial sized circuit, which stores aspects of an answer to your problem, which was allowed infinite time pre-computation. And so you say, okay, well, that's a little bit weird. But what we're going to say is that data is a restricted form of advice. So actually learning from data in the environment, which molecules happen to form, like in natural product synthesis, offers you a sort of provable leg up on simply stepping forward in time. And this is kind of the perspective perhaps that all of science takes, but I think it's nice to lump into a machine learning perspective as well. So how do we step towards learning on a quantum computer specifically? I think a nice connection point to start making this connection is variational algorithms, which are now quite popular to implement on quantum computers. And we sort of make this analogy or this direct connection between the eigenvalue problem, which I stated we know gives us a lot of information about our physical systems if we can get the relevant eigenstates, can be made this correspondence, at least for the ground state, other tricks to get excited states, with this variational principle, where if I have some way of modifying my state, I can easily check the energy for physical systems, and a lower energy will get me closer to this eigenstate and energy. And if I'm close enough, it will get me closer to the eigenstate as well. And so just some state with adjustable parameters where I can iteratively improve it with a classical optimizer already starts to feel a bit like machine learning algorithms. And people have used this in a huge variety of areas now. So just chemistry, nuclear physics, discrete optimization, machine learning. And it really is a nice paradigm for doing something with your quantum computer that kind of maximizes whatever its current capabilities are. But I think it's also something that makes a very nice connection with the machine learning community for trying to figure out where the possible advantages for quantum computing could enter. So just to kind of give you a quick example, in case you don't come from this background, what's one example of such a network that you could have? So I have pictured here an old experiment, but one with a nice diagram, so it's good to reference. Basically, at the bottom, under this software area, we have kind of these quantum circuit diagrams that you read from left to right, like music notation. And every time you hit one of these gates, that's going to correspond to some operation that's done on the top on these two transmon qubits, where you do some action and it manipulates your quantum state. And then you run through, and at the end, you measure some expectation values, and you see at the center, we have this one parameter theta that we can optimize. And so we're going to loop back and forth and update this parameter until it gets more and more close to the energy that I would like it to have. And of course, you have some termination condition, and you hope that you've reached an optimum, but that's a story in and of itself. And so these experiments have continued, and I'm going to draw out one in particular because it's going to fit nicely into the next parts of this narrative, which is to say, basically, if you're familiar with chemistry, one of the most basic primitives are these orbital rotations that one can have. And so these take the form of, say, Gibbons rotations, or we can compile them onto these circuits for our quantum computer. And because of this nice redundancy, we did an experiment recently, and this allows you to mitigate some of the errors that you see in your quantum device. But there were a few reasons we did this experiment: to look at error mitigation, but also to test this primitive, because we do have ways of combining this basis rotation circuit, which you see all these parameters theta. These are the ones that I would train on for my particular experiment. We have ways of combining it with interacting circuits to have sort of the most compact form of time evolution circuits that we know how to do, at least within certain Trotter approximations or certain basis states. And so this analogy of quantum circuits as neural networks has been taken in a few different directions, and I think some of them have been pretty fruitful. For example, you can just do a very coarse identification with your eye and start to at least feel motivated that you should train some of these things like you train neural networks. And we were able to take it a little bit farther by making a connection with vanishing gradients, especially in the recurrent neural network community, where in the typical vanishing gradient problem, you have some cost function. And then as you compose with the chain rules, sort of from right to left, you have gradients that either blow up or diminish exponentially quickly. And this large imbalance in scale halts training. And there are many different solutions to these problems. But if you don't watch out for it, basically it can tank you for kind of the wrong reasons. Not that your problem was unlearnable, but just that your network was a little bit sort of unstable or training procedure was. And in the quantum case, we have the additional difficulty actually that we often don't get, at least for a single sample, gradients to very high precision. So if you start to lose signal, this can take a very, very large number of samples to overcome, which can really ruin your day. But the reason I kind of dipped back into those was that I think it makes an enticing connection with some of the things that I'm about to say. So the classical neural network community struggled for some time with vanishing gradients, and there are many solutions. And especially in the case of recurrent neural networks, where in principle the network can loop over and over and over again, this was a big problem. And one of the solutions was actually the introduction of unitary neural networks that gained a little bit of traction, but basically the idea is that if you have a unitary, as we know, it conserves norm. And so you have less of these problems if you need to apply many of them or even infinitely many of them. And interestingly, so the first paper on unitary neural networks came out, and then an efficient unitary neural network paper came out, which noticed that in fact, these networks were composed entirely of Givens rotations. And if we make our connection back to quantum chemistry, we noticed that they rediscovered that at least these unitary parts were exactly equivalent to the basis rotation circuits that I just showed you. And they use all of the same tricks. I'm not sure anyone on those papers has ever read fermionic chemistry papers, so they probably don't know that this connection is so exact. But essentially, these networks proceeded by doing some unitary rotation, feeding into some nonlinearity, and then repeating many, many times. And so when you see this, you say, well, if I know how to make the classically efficient version fit into an existing performant neural network, doesn't this suggest a very clear way of sort of plugging that in and then boosting its power to try to see if I can do better than the original unitary neural network with a quantum computer? And so this leads you to a very natural line of reasoning. You say, okay, I have this unitary part and this nonlinearity, and if I can make the inputs and outputs match of the unitary and boost its power with quantum computing, then it's only up from here, because I can't do any worse than the classically separable circuit because that's already there, or this basis rotation circuit. So boosting the power with quantum. So this, the story I'm about to tell you is a very real historical artifact of something we tried to do, and I think you'll be interested in its resolution. So the classical case takes n inputs and has n outputs. And if we take this chemistry point of view, as we're doing on question 3 in this conference, a natural choice for the n inputs and outputs is you just take one particle and you distribute it across the n qubits that represent mode occupations. And a natural choice for the output is you can, of course, measure the expected value of a single particle across n modes, or alternatively, you could measure the expected value of the occupations and simply normalize it. Either will work in principle. And so the idea is that I'm going to beef up the power with some new generators. And so at the bottom, I've indicated something like effective dimension. So here, and this is kind of a coarse approximation. If you count dimension very carefully, you'll find that it's not exactly right, but it's close enough. So you take your basis rotation circuit, and now I make some new particles. So I'm not using the Hermitian generators versions, but you can implement them by just taking a complex conjugate and working with it. So I make some particles, I add some fermionic interactions, I add some more basis rotations, and I loop it over and over again. And it's pretty easy to see that if you do this enough times, you actually can do arbitrary quantum operations. So everyone would sort of agree that this is a very hard circuit because it's an arbitrary quantum circuit. I could do any operation and fit it into this mold. And so you would agree that unless classical computers are the same as quantum computers, you would probably need a quantum computer to get the output. And this remains true now as I break it down, maybe destroy some particles, or just measure the final result and get out something that I'd like at the end. So now I have n inputs, n outputs, and I've done some incredibly hard quantum circuit in the middle, where if you don't have a quantum computer, given that input, you cannot tell me to any reasonable accuracy what my output would be. So great, I've bumped up the power with quantum, great success. I'm going to put it into that unitary neural network, and now with the non-linearities, my input output, I'm going to just, crush machine learning. It's going to be great. But let's let our model, before we do that, have a little bit of data as a treat. So let's take some data. We'll take some input data that I'll specify. It'll be kind of the same model as before, where I have these p-dimensional. I switched, p and n to keep you on your toes, but p-dimensional input vectors, which I'm just going to encode in p of these basis states. And I'm going to add in some arbitrary length quantum circuit at the end, and I'm going to measure a Hermitian observable, and that's going to give me my yi out at the end. And we just mentioned before that direct simulation, so just getting the yi's given x in a circuit specification, is at least as hard as BQP. And so this must be a pretty powerful function of xi, right? But now let's compute the expected value, what actually happens when I just crunch through the math here at the end. And so I dress my observable O with some very complicated unitary, but at the end, I end up with this expression, which you'll notice is just two sums over the dimension P and some of these inputs. And what I found is that by getting my quantum computer a little bit of data as a treat, it's at most a quadratic function on the entries of xi with p squared coefficients. And we kind of show through learning theoretic means that you need, even in the case of like a general data distribution, at most p squared data points in order to get this model exactly. And so basically what's happened is that with no data, this is a very hard quantum circuit. And with only a little bit of quantum data, this is an almost trivial learning task. So all you have to do is kind of set up a quadratic model, and you can prove that you have very much bounded error. So this was kind of the first, and maybe some of you knew this, but trivial observation that led us down a path, which is to say, well, if this can happen in this case, can I really say anything about the general case of when data elevates classical models to be as powerful as quantum ones? And what can I really say about this problem? And so we did some work to prove that there was in fact a rigorous computer science separation between these classical algorithms like BPP, quantum computation, BQP, this advice class that I mentioned, which is P/Poly, so it can solve undecidable problems, so it's much stronger. But BPP SAMP is this kind of classical computer, but now endowed with data either from a quantum computer, so classical samples from it, or some other source of natural data. And there is in fact a separation, and having data makes you stronger in some kind of strict sense. And so from a practical point of view now, do I start to dissect whether I have any chance at having a quantum advantage? So remember, if you're working in quantum computing, you feel like there should be some way to at least set up quantum models and understand when classical ones are competitive with them. So I'm not going to go through this chart yet, but rather build it piece by piece and return to it. And there'll be some sense of a geometry test and a label specific chance that will let me cheaply diagnose any opportunities that I have. So to do that, I need to introduce quantum kernel methods, kind of do so in a slide. So a kernel method, what we mean by this is we want to take advantage of well-developed methods that only need as some input a pairwise proxy for the geometry or the kernel. So if I have some input data points xi and xj, I want some similarity measure k xi xj that tells me how close 2 points are. And some methods can be built around entirely just this quantity evaluated on real points. And that includes, say, like support vector machines, support vector regressions, and other techniques which can be related to kernels. And the nice part of these tricks is that this kernel, and it took me a while to understand the details of this, but it implies some map to a feature space, maybe even infinite dimensional, where when you learn linear functions in this, you learn kind of crazy separating boundaries. And nominally speaking, there is classical ML, which has classical kernels, but if I compute my kernel on my quantum computer, that kernel, that Kij matrix, can still be fed to the classical machine, and I can use all of the machinery there to do learning on top of that and benefit from the best of both worlds. And that was sort of the idea around the quantum kernel method that was introduced. And I've put in parentheses here, quadratic, for a reason, because I think it's instructive to look at this for 1 second. So if you take the most natural quantum kernel that you might imagine. So notice up here, this this kernel always maps to an inner product of feature vectors in this large feature space. So quantum has a natural inner product, which is just this xi, xj, which I've denoted in bracket notation. And you can check that this makes a perfectly fine kernel. It's positive semi-definite. It's just an overlap or a gram matrix, if you will. And you can immediately figure out that the feature map it implies is just going back to the linear vector. But there's actually a little bit of a problem with that. When you look at the terms required to compute an expectation value, so I'm going to learn linear functions in this feature space, that actually exclude expectation values. I'm missing the cross terms in the most general case. So this is actually a poor choice of inner product. And for that reason, you actually take the kernel, which is the square of the inner product. So this seems like a very benign change. How could squaring these things before giving them off make a measurable change? But in fact, this is the magic of these kernel methods, which is simple changes on these relationships imply vast changes in the feature space. And now this quantum kernel, once I square it and deliver it to my quantum or classical computer, I can actually learn observables. So let's set up some of the models that we're going to talk about to kind of break this down even more. So I'm going to have some xi, which is my classical data. And in this case, I'm going to have it be initial state, or maybe it specifies a Hamiltonian, or it's just general data. I'm going to perform an encoding map, which acts on some general initial state. And then I'll have this arbitrary length quantum neural network or dividing surface, or just unitary, if you will. And I've written this in a form that's suggestive of being amenable to quantum computing. But in fact, if you look at it, you can see that if I replace these things with reversible circuits and added ancilla space on padding on my data, this is actually an arbitrary computational circuit. So this model is actually, despite the way I've written it, encompasses more or less all of what you would consider traditional computation, quantum or classical. So it's quite powerful. And so I'm going to get out the other side after I do these things, some amount of data. And some fun observations that I won't delve into too deeply, but you can check the paper for, is that the quantum kernel is actually invariant to the form of this dividing surface once you take out the observable. And if you have enough data, depending on the function, the quantum kernel is equivalent to an infinite depth quantum neural network. This was the basis of the dimension test, which I won't have a chance to talk about today, but it's a way that you kind of quantify how close that you're getting to this, but also the consequences, how it might cause poor prediction error. And so let's think for a second about the fidelity as a metric, basically. So the fidelity is what a lot of methods are based on for trying to draw similarity between quantum states. And that works okay if you have a handful of qubits, say between 5 and 10 or less than that. But you start to realize that as you start doing more interesting quantum operations, it's actually quite a stringent metric. If you take two random states in quantum space, they start to have exponentially small overlap, and trying to grow that overlap or quantify it, you very quickly start to find that almost everything looks equally far apart. And you can even do that with bit strings, where you take, say, a length n bit string, and if you flip one spin on that, that's equally far in a fidelity metric as if you flip n spins from that. And so it doesn't quite feel like a notion of distance that you would like to have, where things that are kind of close by are, more easily quantified than things are kind of far away, and you don't conclude everything is far apart. So I'm going to advocate a little bit for local successive fidelity approximations, I guess. This is maybe a fancy way of saying that if my local observables match, I would like this to kind of reflect the closeness of two states. And I would like it to be able to build back up to that thing in a kind of rigorous way, but not to force me into a fidelity mold. And so for that reason, we introduced this projected quantum kernel. And what this was, if you remember this quadratic quantum kernel, so you'll often hear it referred as quantum kernel because it was the original, but I'm drawing the distinction here to mean that, a quantum kernel could be any kernel produced on a quantum computer. And this specific one is the one often discussed. This was this inner product squared, which is the fidelity. And in practice, if you go and try to use some non-trivial encoding, you find out that very often, basically, the information you get back is it's either the exact state you put in, or it's orthogonal. So you get a kernel matrix that is basically the identity, which if you think about it for a second, can only correspond to memorization. And so that means that if I gave you the same point back, I can tell you, oh yeah, that's the same point, it must have the same label. Or you give another point and it looks equally and like more or less infinitely far from every other point you've seen so far. So instead, we wanted to work with local surrogates that could kind of work our way a little bit closer to this more gradually and not suffer from quite the same exponential collapse as the kind of direct fidelity type metrics. And so instead, we decided to work a little bit with reduced density matrices. So you have some output state that you encoded. You can measure the reduced density matrix of these n qubits. And then what we used is a little more magic from traditional machine learning to bump this up with a nonlinear kernel. And so like I was mentioning before, even that innocuous change of squaring something can greatly increase the power of functions I can learn. And it's been seen that these exponential kernels for simple functions classically, in fact, can form, say, universal functions approximators. So I haven't proven the same here for reduced density matrix, but you can imagine that this can perform almost arbitrary functions on these reduced density matrices, which makes that an extremely powerful kernel to learn on. And I think this question of connection to chemistry is an interesting one, because you might say, well, that's almost no information compared to the wave function. But the number of universality results in chemistry related to density functional theory, both in the time-dependent and independent case, where the density alone, not even the reduced density matrix, is enough to uniquely determine things, you might start to wonder in which situations this kernel can provide you almost everything you would need about a physical system, and it scales fairly well also. And so the central kind of theoretical quantities that I'll be talking about are trying to bound this prediction error. So of course, I don't want to worry about the training data I have. I want to be able to say something rigorous about data from the same distribution, but samples I've never seen before. And to do this, we're going to kind of center around this quantity and walk ourselves through it, which is to say this data distribution D, I'm going to take expected values, and I'm going to machine learn this function H from this true arbitrary computation F that I gave you. And I'm going to do so on n training samples and have a central quantity Sk. And so what is this central quantity? Well, most of the proofs I'm going to do are going to center around kernel methods. But in fact, the numerics that I show you in a few minutes will include methods that have no natural kernel as well. But intuitively, if f of x1 is close to f of x2, when this k12 is large or points are close in feature space, then Sk is small and my prediction error is good. So this Sk also gives me a feeling for the number of training samples I would need to close the learning gap as well if I wanted to match the performance of data coming from, say, a quantum computer. And the actual quantity is just kind of this simple expression below. I've omitted in a lot of these slides the details of regularization, but you can find those in the paper, and it's kind of important to include when you do the computations, but you can get the feel of how the quantities act without all the shifts in lambda and the training over the hyperparameters and things like this. So in fact, from that quantity, and this kind of builds to the chart that we're going to use, you can break down and learn something even more general, which is you can learn something about all possible labeled functions F. So if you define this quantity, you can set up a simple inequality for a classical kernel and a quantum kernel. And what I mean by this is usually you have some quantum kernel that you're hopeful for, and you can then go take the kernel and use this kind of one-sided distance function and check a ton of classical methods that you think might be reasonable and take the minimum out of those that you find, which is G. And what you can conclude is that if GCQ is small, there is no function or any labeling of the data you have where quantum outperforms classical. If GCQ is large, then there exists some function where quantum has the edge in that feature space, but you might not know what that function is. And actually, there's a simple method to create a fake F which saturates GCQ. And we use that a bit later just to see the potential of some of these methods. So, I've talked a bit about some of the bounds, and there's a lot of proofs in the paper related to how they are, but you might want to know how well these things work in practice. So what we did was some numerical tests we took the fashion-imness data set, we did a PCA, this gives us in components to give us some source of data for Xi. We tried a number of embeddings ranging from more quantum to, or less quantum to more quantum. So just some separable rotation you can call classical, something related to IQP circuits, it's a little more quantum, and then kind of a long Heisenberg evolution with a ton of gates. And you'd start to feel like this is pretty quantum given the time steps, even though it doesn't exactly mimic the Hamiltonian, it's in some sense even more correlated. And then I'm going to have some set of labels like the original fashion-imness labels, or some quantum labels, Q over here at the right, where you'll notice that these quantum labels are in fact very stilted in a way because the labels themselves contain the embedding. So that should give a pretty dramatic advantage to a quantum model, which is built off of these embeddings. And finally, I'm going to look at engineered models, which use that method I don't have time to describe to saturate GQ completely. And in all of the following, I'm going to reference some classical competition. So when I say best classical, it will come from a pool of methods that have been tried. So like AdaBoost, random forest, neural networks, deeper neural networks, gradient boosting, all hyperparameter tuned. And then we choose the best amongst them for our comparison for any given piece of data. And that method sometimes changes even on the same graph, but we always plot the best one to kind of give you a feeling for what it is. So how well do these predictive metrics perform? So basically, we looked at each of these embeddings, E1, E2, E3, on both these projected quantum, PQ, and quantum kernel. And we see some interesting behavior that initially, for some of these data sets, you get a growth in this geometric difference. And remember, large difference means there's any function that you might learn that's kind of quantum classically separated. And a small one means that no function you put down will ever exceed it. And you see that for the quantum kernel, because of this sort of fidelity decay problem, you often quickly converge to there being no function where there can be any separation. And now if you, instead of looking at the class of all functions, you look at the specific data labels I mentioned, you learn something kind of interesting. So for at least data sets at the two at the top, so embedding 1 and embedding 2, here we've plotted prediction errors, so lower is better. You see that this line, which is the green circles, best classical ML, is kind of tracking the lowest possible prediction error. So it's more or less within hitting distance of what you could do. And remember, in this case, I heavily stilted the data for the quantum computer. So this is kind of evidence of this power of data where I've taken a classical model that's agnostic of the embedding, and I've used it on this data, which was heavily stilted for quantum, and the classical one still came out ahead for these cases of both the separable circuit and the sort of IQP-like circuits. And finally, in the kind of E3 slot in the bottom left quadrant there, you see that there's an appreciable separation between some of the projected quantum kernels for this very, very quantum data set, but the gap is not so large. And this is really evidence of, if you don't do anything special, this power imbued by data and kernel methods can really elevate classical methods to compete with quantum ones, granted they were given data from quantum approaches. And so, not being terribly satisfied with that end of the story, we tipped the scales, as I alluded to in a bit, which is to say we used this prescriptive method for saturating this geometric difference. So you find some kernels that greatly disagree, and you write down a function which maximizes the separation. It's just like a simple eigenvalue and rounding kind of problem. And for the first two, you see that when this geometric difference was small, you in fact, even in this stilted case, you're led to believe that quantum or the classical methods are just as competitive. But finally, when you reach this very quantum, very stilted case, you can at least find evidence that there exists functions with the projected quantum kernel where you find an appreciable separation, even up to 30 qubits for these different models. And this is kind of important to note that, some behavior early on was, it looked like perhaps the quantum kernels were working well before they converged to the identity matrix as you went larger and larger. And for that reason, I'm a big advocate of, kind of checking that these things work at scale. So if you had tried some of these methods on, say, only up to 5 qubits, you'll notice that there's qualitative and quantitative changes happening in kind of the 0 to 15 qubits regime. And so we went up to 30 qubits to see whether these trends at least kept stabilizing. This wasn't an easy feat. So hat tip to Michael Broughton, and this was enabled by TensorFlow Quantum. You know, we had a lot of samples, we had a lot of models to check, and we had very large systems at 30 qubits. And so we needed a lot of compute to actually push this as far as we could go and feel confident in our trends. And so we actually managed with TensorFlow Quantum to hit a petaflop peak performance and an exaflop of total compute, which is a fair amount. And in fact, if you're interested in this, there's a full tutorial implementation of everything I'm talking about available on the website, where you can walk through both like kind of the toy examples of all the learning problems, and then a blog post of how we scaled it to that. And by we, I mean Michael. And so with that, I want to just take a step back and take another look at some of these open questions now that I've hopefully helped you embrace this idea that data from a quantum system is actually a bit more powerful than just rote computation on that same quantum system. And so if data from quantum computers can lift learning above direct simulation competition, what can quantum simulation do for chemistry? Many of the problems in design, synthesis, and biology feel like undecidable problems in kind of a hand-wavy sense. What can we say about the way data from nature helps us? Is the fate of quantum computers largely to provide data for classical machine learning algorithms? And I actually think that as tantalizing as that sounds, there's some recent results that say perhaps not, which showed that even a single additional copy of a quantum state in quantum memory can give you an exponential separation for worst case query advantage. And I think it's still an open question how chemistry can utilize that for practical purposes. So kind of in summary, you know, I hope you've enjoyed this a bit of an unusual walk through kind of a quantum and learning perspective on simulation, which is we have this natural task of quantum simulation, which is to push things forward in time. But we've already used human learning or insights to reduce these to models where we can do computation that inform things on timescales much longer than we can afford to directly simulate. I've argued that some problems in chemistry actually feel kind of undecidable, but that's not a death sentence. It's kind of a suggestion for resolutions where we might start to argue that data can help free us from that necessity for practical purposes. And I've constructed part of this quantum advantage prediction tree where I just kind of broke apart a few pieces of it for you, where if you give me some set of data and some quantum models, I can try to tell you whether quantum models will ever have a chance of beating the classical ones. And I hope I showed you that in some cases, at least in engineered cases, there was a chance where this could happen. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the people that really did the work here. Of course, all of my co-authors listed at the bottom and the quantum AI team, but in particular, Robert Wong, who did most of this work actually when he was an intern with us. He's extremely bright and talented, and everything that was correct and rigorous in this presentation is his. Everything that was shot from the hip and wrong was mine. And Michael Broughton, the kind of mastermind behind TensorFlow Quantum and the king of scaling, and his wonderful style GAN of our chip that I've featured his art next to it. So with that, thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions with time I have left over, which might be scant, but I'll do my best.
No, you did great time-wise, and thank you for the very interesting talk. So I'm going to read the first question because it's short, and then I'll give access to the second person asking the second question. So the first question is the Preskill et al. 2021 paper sounds kind of pessimistic. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so the Preskill 2021 paper. So this one, so it's kind of an interesting paper. So Robert, who is also the first author on this paper and the first author on the Preskill paper, they had a series of proofs which basically showed that when you look at average case prediction in query complexity separation, you find something that can at most be sort of polynomial. But if you think about what that means for queries, in the case of data, you might not have access to arbitrarily more data. And so that might be a fairly substantial advantage in practice. And that's kind of waits to be seen. The advantage that I was talking about that was exponential was worst case, where there are incredibly simple cases where you can do overwhelmingly better, but you might feel that the average case is the more natural one. So I think that their proof of separation in the average case, and in that it's kind of only polynomial, feels a little pessimistic when you first think about it. But if you think about it in the setting of, well, I'm only ever going to get so much data, that still might be a fairly substantial advantage. So I don't feel too negatively about it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, so the second question by Srinivasan, can someone, if he has been unmuted, can ask the question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Hi, thanks for your talk. So is there any provable guarantees for these? So you have these plots towards the end, right? So can you show any provable guarantees that these quantum feature spaces are much better, like they get better classification rate or something?
So you could sort of, the bounds we have for these particular problems kind of show that the prediction error is in some sense better for these problems. But if you mean like provable predictions in a sort of totally general scenario, I don't think we can have that yet. And that's more or less because what you need is some notion of feature map that scales for the data that you're interested in. So we contrived these engineered cases, and these engineered cases do in some sense have rigorous guarantees attached to them, but they're also a little bit unsatisfying because they just show you that there could exist label functions for which this is the case, but it doesn't show you any kind of useful ones yet. Maybe, is that what you were asking?
I'm asking, can we prove anything about like, is there any problem for which quantum kernels are provably better in some sense?
Yes. So I omitted this slide. It's an appendix in our paper, and someone else wrote an entire paper on it. This might be a little bit of a stilted example, but there are ways of, in sort of one page, using the projected kernel that I showed you to write number factoring as a quadratic learning problem on kernels. And you can show in the worst case, we have an exponential separation where basically the gist of it is that you run Shor's algorithm and you get out the right answers, and that's your embedding, and you have a wonderful provable advantage, but you might feel a little unsatisfied by that. But the proofs do exist and are fairly concise. So yeah.
I see. So my second question was about these IQP. So you had this slide on IQP circuits and these E3 circuits, right?
Yeah.
Right. So do you observe that as you increase the depth of the circuits, the quantum feature spaces are much more expressive? Like intuitively, this should be true, but is it provable?
Actually, so one of the things that I feel is the biggest open questions in this area is coming up with better embedding. So let me say more about that. So E1 was classical. E2 and E3 were designed to introduce some more quantum features to this space. But in fact, if you keep making them longer and longer, you start to have theorems about it being hard to sample from the bit strings. But in practice, what you also have is concentration of measure in any observables you'd use to extract actual features for your Hilbert space. So there's kind of this Goldilocks principle where you need the circuits to be long enough to be hard to simulate classically, but short enough or structured enough that they don't wash out all information. And so we weren't able to resolve that problem. These E2 and E3, if you just blew them up to larger depth, I think you'd wash out any signal. And so to me, this is like a major open question. And I think we say as much in the paper, kind of puzzling how you can resolve this Goldilocks feature or Goldilocks principle for like real data you're interested in, but I don't have an answer yet. So.
I have a very closely related question. So if I may ask it before we take the last question from the audience. These look like very symmetric choices. Is that something that has to be that way, or is it just a simple choice?
You mean for the embeddings themselves, or?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, these were a little bit, we just chose them from well-known circuits in the literature because we felt like that would be stable ground to walk on. Like IQP has some results around it. Simulation of Heisenberg models or Trotter simulation. Granted, these are time steps large enough that that's not the real Hamiltonian that you're looking at, but they could have been pretty arbitrary. It's just a matter of like finding that signal that you want as you put the data in. What functions of that data do you express? Does it give you a nice signal? But yeah, the short answer is they could have been much more arbitrary than they were. We just chose them systematically for reasons of grounding to the literature, but also if you saw in the plots, we just wanted to increase the number of qubits systematically without changing the nature of the ansatz too much. And so like the one in 5 qubits looks kind of like the one at 20 qubits. So not too much is changing along that axis. So yeah.
Yeah, great. So last question by Jonas Kubler. Can we unmute him if he's not already?
I think I'm already unmuted, probably. So I want to come back to these accuracies that you showed. And if I understand correctly, you basically run this experiment like for a fixed sample size. But like the bound that you showed is kind of like with higher probability as your sample size increase, then you have this 1/√n behavior. And so I'm kind of wondering, because the way I understand you simulate your data, there's no noise on the label or on the f of x, right? So I would assume that, say, kernel rich regression with a Gaussian kernel should at some point, if you grow the sample size, converge to accuracy 1. And I'm kind of wondering, like, can you ensure that the effect that you show on the slide is not just particular for this sample size? Right, so I can't hear anything anymore.
Did we lose Jarrod?
We can still see his screen though, right?
Yeah, I wonder if it froze. Okay, so maybe we can, it appears like we lost them. So maybe if Jarrod can hear us but cannot speak. Oh, yeah, I think we lost him. So I will ask Jarrod to answer this on the last question on Slack, on any other questions. And we can now move to the second speaker of the session.
I'll share my slides.
Yes, please share your slides. So the second speaker is Abhinav Anand from Toronto, and he'll tell us about natural evolutionary strategies for variational quantum computing.
Thanks, Sophia, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for letting me speak at this conference. So today I'll be talking about using natural evolutionary strategies for optimization of variational quantum algorithms. And to give a brief overview of what my talk would consist of, it would basically be of three different, it is basically talking about three different aspects. I'll very briefly touch on what I mean when I say a variational quantum algorithm, and then talk briefly about how do we train these algorithms and the problems associated with them. And then in the end, I'll introduce natural evolutionary strategies and why should one use them for optimization of variational algorithms. Okay, so let's begin. So when I say a variational quantum algorithm, I kind of picture this modular piece where you have different modules that work together harmoniously to solve problems which either of them alone would not be able to solve on their own. So like a general variational algorithm would use the quantum computer to prepare these parameterized states, which then can be measured, or which then you measure the expectation value of the problem Hamiltonian and feed these measurements to a classical subroutine or a classical computer, which then comes up with a set of instructions or for the quantum computer to perform. And based on these instructions, it gathers some information about certain new parameters that the quantum computer should use to prepare the next set of states. And this goes on like iteratively until like either you reach convergence or you reach this minima. And this works really good because these problems are based on these variational principle which says that the expectation value of certain problems are bounded by these values. So basically, it's like you have these classical routines and you have a quantum routine, and both of them are working together to solve problems which are very hard in general. So before I talk about trainability of these quantum algorithms, I just wanted to point out how do we choose these parameterized, or what kind of parameterized state should I prepare for on the quantum computer so that I can solve different problems. And basically, it can be, you can think of them as two broad categories. And the first category is what is known as the problem-inspired ansatz, where you take into consideration previous information from like previous studies or previous details, and you construct a circuit, or you construct an ansatz based on your previous knowledge to prepare these states. And here on my slide, I show you a simple example of a UCC ansatz, or a unitary coupled cluster ansatz, which is used primarily for electronic structure or electronic Hamiltonians to get the ground state energies. And what I want you to take away from this slide is that I could not fit a circuit for a UCC for even a small molecule like hydrogen on this slide, because they tend to grow very long, or the size of these circuits grow exponential, or like grow very rapidly as you increase the problem size. So if you want to use a problem-inspired ansatz, you have this problem that the size of the circuit grows pretty rapidly. So to kind of tackle this problem, people came up with this another type of ansatz known as hardware-efficient ansatz, where what you do is you kind of try to come up with expressible unitary, or try to kind of approximate a general unitary which can express, or which can contain your solution. And so to do that, what you do is you kind of assemble sets of single qubit gates and 2 qubit gates and try to make this general unitary. So, and here I show you a simple example of the hardware efficient ansatz, where you have layers of rotation gates followed by layers of entangling gates, and then you repeat it some number of times to make it more and more expressive, or so that it can reach the whole Hilbert space. But as you can see from the picture, that making this incurs the problem that you have to put in a lot of parameters in these ansatzes. So like if you choose a problem-inspired ansatz, your circuit size increases, you have low number of parameters, but your circuit size is large. But for a hardware efficient ansatz, you might be able to have a short circuit, but then you have a lot of parameters. And because and there are ways where you can reduce these circuits by adaptively constructing these ansatzes too, and that is one way of reducing the size of the circuit. But I'll stick to these two cases where you have these fixed ansatzes. And so, like, to train these circuits, what you will, I paint a very simple picture here where you can imagine this as the optimization landscape, and then you have this initial set of parameters which I denote by initial value, and you want to go to the optimal value, or the optimal set of parameters for these quantum circuits. So what you would want to do is you would want to find the best path, or a path from this initial set of parameters to this optimal value. And to do that, the traditional way of doing that would be to take the gradient of your objective function with respect to the parameters, and then move along the gradient to the optimal value. But as Jarrod mentioned in his previous talk, where he showed about the difficulty in training quantum circuits, is that as the size of your circuits increase, and if you don't have any information about a good initial set of parameters, what you see is, for random circuits, the mean of the gradient as well as the variance of the gradient tend to exponentially vanish in the number of layers, so like the depth of the circuit, and also in the size of the circuits. So like if you have no information about what set of parameters you should choose for a given problem, you kind of end up in these flat surfaces, or your optimization surface is super flat, so you don't have a sense of direction in which to go towards the optimal solution. Later, it was shown by the group of Patrick Coles at Los Alamos National Laboratories that it's not just the initial guess that kind of influences this flatness. You also have to consider the locality of your cost function. So if you have a local cost function, you might be able to find certain solution. But if you have a global cost function, this flatness of the surface kind of increases a bit. And later they showed again that it's if like all these results before I was talking about were considered in without the presence of noise. And then they did the study where they explored the effect of noise on the flatness of the surface, and they showed that like the more noise that you have in your quantum circuit, the worse it gets for you to optimize. So you have to restrict your circuits to a smaller size. And there has been a lot of study that has tried to solve these problems. And there are ways to like maybe come up with a better initialization or use like layer-wise learning and stuff like that. But we wanted to come up with, or we also wanted to look at some alternative strategy which helps in optimization of these deep quantum circuits, so to say. But we have not considered the effect of noise in our study. So what we thought was, instead of thinking of the parameter as a single point, why not replace that by a distribution? So maybe put the information about the landscape in the distribution of these parameters. And then basically this is what people use in evolutionary strategies, where they basically have these parameter distribution from which they sample certain number of points to gain understanding about the optimization landscape. And then based on the sampled parameters, they kind of evaluate which direction they should move in towards the optimal solution. And then like what effectively what you would want is, you would want to start with a broad distribution. And then once you have a direction, you want to move in that direction while reducing the size of, or narrowing the distribution as you move along. So like your end or your final solution would be just a very narrowly peaked distribution at your optimal value. And the evolutionary strategies has been used extensively in like classical machine learning literature for very high dimensional problems. And as I said before, it kind of iteratively updates the parameters of the distribution of your parameter distribution to kind of reach towards the optimal value. A thing to note here is that because the gradients are estimated by a fixed number of samples that you draw from your distribution, the number of function evaluations does not depend on the number of parameters in your problem, but it rather depends on the number of samples that you draw from the distribution to estimate a direction. And here I show a pseudocode for a canonical evolutionary strategy, that is like the traditional evolutionary strategies, where what you're doing is you are starting with a normal distribution centered at 0 with unit variance. You're sampling certain number of points, and then you're transforming these points to the like centered at your parameter of your circuit, and then of the variance. And then you're evaluating these fitness corresponding to these points, and then based on these fitness functions, you kind of evaluate what is the best direction to move in, and then you update your parameters of the circuit, and then keep on doing this iteratively until you reach convergence. So we wanted to see and use this strategy to kind of see if we are able to kind of not get stuck in this flat region that people have been seeing. So for that, what we wanted to do was we wanted to just look at the same graph that Jarrod had in his paper, where they showed the exponential decrease in the variance of the gradients. So we chose the same problem, where the problem is just preparing this all zero state. So the Hamiltonian associated with problem is the projector into the all zero states. And we use this randomly constructed circuit, where the first layer is basically rotating out of the all zero states, followed by a layer of rotation gates, which are chosen at random, and then a layer of entangling gates. And this can be repeated as many times for throughout the simulation. So we ran the test, and here are the results from three different different simulation with different parameters. The leftmost plot basically is when you have your initial distribution has a variance of pi by 8. The middle one has a variance of pi by 16, and the right one has a variance of pi over 32. So what you can see is, and we ran different number of samples that we use to estimate the search direction. So what takeaway from these plots was that you have certain degree of control over the search or the magnitude of these search direction gradients that you can estimate. So by varying the number of or by varying the width of the initial distribution, you can kind of increase or decrease the estimated gradient. And the other thing to note here would be that as you increase the number of samples, your gradient kind of go worse and worse. And that is expected to be true, right? Because as you increase the number of samples, you are kind of like getting closer to the actual gradient. And we already know that the actual gradient or the variance of these gradient is 0. So like you kind of are getting worse and worse. So you want to choose these parameters like the initial variance and the number of samples to certain values so that you don't run into these problems. But this is just like a direction, right? This could be just a random direction. So we had to we have to kind of investigate if this direction is the valid direction, or if the strategy, the direction that this strategy gives us is a valid direction, and we can optimize these problems. So for that, we kind of did not use just the evolutionary strategies, but use the modified strategies, which are known as natural evolutionary strategies, which instead of using the plain gradient, use an estimate of the natural gradient, and also can be tailored to include the full covariance matrix, or also just having a diagonal covariance matrix. And these strategies are called separable and exponential natural evolutionary strategies. They also use these techniques called fitness shaping to remove the dependence on the actual fitness value, use local coordinates, which basically helps reduce the runtime for calculation of these Fisher information matrix for the natural gradient, and adaptive sampling to kind of increase or change the learning rates for the different type of parameters. And it has been shown that if these techniques kind of improve natural evolutionary strategies and make them even more robust, at least in the classical machine learning literature. And then here I show you a sample pseudocode for one of the strategies called separable natural strategies, which only consider your covariance matrix to be diagonal. So it's, again, you can see like you have these, you draw like n of these samples from your local coordinate, and then you transform it to the task coordinate, evaluate the fitness, transform it into these utility functions, which kind of rank them based on it being best or worst, and then compute gradients and iteratively update the mean and the variance of your parameter distribution, and just do this iteratively until convergence. So then, because we wanted to see if we can, if the search direction that we got was a valid direction, or it was not just a random direction that if you move along that direction, you just get lost. So what we did was we ran full simulations. And here I show you two plots from two different types of simulation. The plot on the left is when we had, we are still doing the state preparation. So our Hamiltonian is the projector into all 0 states, and we are choosing a random circuit. And here I show you results on the left. The results are for a circuit with 15 qubits with varying number of layers. And what you can see that we can do the optimization. That obviously what you see here is as the number of layers increase, the rate of convergence slows down, which is expected right now because you have more parameters. So it's hard for you to find the optimal path. And so because we thought, okay, maybe it might take a while for if you increase these size of the circuit even more. So we decided that instead of doing full optimization, maybe we should try doing batch optimization. So basically, instead of like optimizing all the parameters at once, you just optimize a certain section, And here I show you results from that strategy where we had a 10-qubit circuit with different number of layers from 50 to 500. And basically, we chose the 50, the batch size was fixed to 50, and we kind of chose them randomly here. So what you can see is that in all these cases, you are able to like get away from this initial point, and like you are not stuck in this flat surfaces that people have found. So like you are able to get away from these flat surfaces, at least in these simulations. So we also wanted to see, okay, good, that this works. So how does this compare with if you used just the plain gradient-based methods or plain gradient descent? So we ran certain simulation to compare gradient-based methods with the natural evolutionary strategies. And what you can note here is that here on the left, I show you the results from a 10-qubit 20-layer circuit doing full optimization. And on the right, I show you a 10-qubit 50-layer circuit using batch optimization. One thing that you can kind of see is like one of these strategies, which is the XNES here, which takes the full covariance matrix into picture, does not work pretty good if you do the full optimization. So like it does not make sense to have the full covariance matrix once you have a very large circuit, because all these parameters might not be correlated, and this causes some issues. But the other natural evolutionary strategies, which is the separable one, which only considers a diagonal covariance matrix, works really good for both of the cases and outperforms natural or gradient-based methods, at least initially. So the other thing that to note here is like gradient descent sometimes works really good. So like the shadow that I show, like in the best case, gradient descent goes like finds the optimal solutions very fastly. But there are what matters here is like there are a lot of these number of cases where you see that the gradient descent cannot find the optimal for a certain number of iteration, and once it has certain idea, then it converges really fast. So basically, what this gave us information about is that if gradient descent is able to find an initial path or initial gradient towards the optimal solution, it converges to that solution very fastly, and it catches up with the natural evolutionary strategies very fastly. So we thought maybe it isn't worth doing the full optimization with natural evolutionary strategies. Maybe we could just use natural evolutionary strategies for for initialization of these parameters, and then once you had a large enough gradient, use gradient-based methods for convergence. And so for that, what we did was we chose two different circuit sizes, so like 18-qubit 10 layers and 15-qubit 50 layers. And what we did was we optimized for a certain number of iteration using natural evolutionary strategies, and then calculated the analytical gradients of all the parameters in the circuit with respect and at all these iterations. And here we plot them. So what you can see is that at the beginning, you have like very small gradients, and then after five or 10 steps of optimization with natural evolutionary strategies, you're able to increase the gradients by a factor of 10 or something like that. So this again tells us that maybe we should use natural evolutionary strategies in this initial region where you don't have sufficient gradients to find an optimal solution, to kind of amplify these gradients, and then use gradient-based methods to reach convergence. And yeah, so we also tried, so all this simulation that I have talked about previously was about the state preparation problem, where we use this randomly constructed circuit. So we wanted to kind of see if this also applies to like a problem-based or a problem-inspired ansatz. So we chose the water molecule in the manual basis, which is a 14-qubit and roughly 30 parameters circuit. And we initialized the parameters randomly and carried all the three different optimization: the separable, natural evolutionary studies, the exponential, and the gradient-based method. And what you can see is like all the methods kind of work equally well here. It's a problem where all of them perform equally well. But one of the things to note here is that if you remember from the plots that I showed before, that exponential natural evolutionary strategies did not work as you increase the size of the qubit, because you were considering the full covariance matrix, but they work really well, or they work equally well as compared to the other strategies here, because considering the covariance matrix or the full covariance matrix kind of helps in the optimization. So when you're thinking about a certain problem, you have to consider if you have certain correlation between the parameters, and then you might be able to use either of these strategies. So in conclusion, I hope I was able to convince you that natural evolutionary strategies can be used in an alternative tool for optimization of variational algorithms. But as I talked about, they kind of, the rate of convergence using these strategies are slower. So maybe just use these strategies for amplifying gradients in regions where you have very small gradients, and then use gradient-based method for convergence. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that a single iteration of natural evolutionary strategies only take like whatever number of samples that you take, and do not depend on the number of parameters in your circuit, which is not the case for gradient-based methods, where the number of circuit evaluations depends on the number of parameters in the circuit. So, and we are working on gaining whatever insights that we gained from this study, we are trying to extend this to other applications. And I'd like to thank Anand and Matthias, who were an integral part of this project, and some group members from the Matter Lab for useful discussions and help throughout the project. And thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Abhinav. Are there questions? So have you tried this for two type of ansatz? Did I understand that right?
Yeah. So we had like the randomly constructed chosen ansatz, and we call it the UCC ansatz.
You haven't tried for other more kind of problem tailored ansatz? Okay.
No.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, if not, then there are later. You can ask Abhinav on Slack as well. Okay, so thank you to both speakers, and this concludes this session. Thank you to everybody for attending.